that industry has nothing to do with us. Or the other part is it's making them feel like they're second rate, so you're not kind of playing to their heart to do those things. What I have found work is when you actually, this will sound strange, play to the people who have their ear. So who is it that is the influencer to
what
the
might
stakeholder?
be an example of that?
I think if you can actually, if you know who the key influencers are to those most senior players there, if you can actually get them on board and explain in terms of what other organisations doing, how it would align with the strategy, how there's business benefit and what you're trying to do, and how it's, this will sound odd as well, how it's safe to make that move, then because you're relying on their personal success, then you're more likely to get that.
Okay,
very good. Look, the example I have is my past role as a head of learning and development. One of the things that we did is we transformed it by actually saying to ourselves, what don't we know about the people that we employ as mortgage brokers coming into the organisation? And so we did a whole suite of analytics on that in terms of what is the average age of the person, what background are they coming from, why have they actually chosen to do this? We found out that 62% of all the people that were actually joining our organisation had received a redundancy payout, and of that 62%, 40% of them had received a redundancy payout from a financial services organisation previously. So one, they were sticking with what they knew. Secondly, they were actually seeing it as an opportunity to be able to continue to do something that they did but have their own business, and they felt that they were actually coming from a place of expertise. Now, the realities are you lose around about 76% of all people who actually start and get their qualifications as a mortgage broker, because it's a lot harder than what people think it is. The most important aspect of that was, though, to actually start to say, how do we introduce innovation within the organisation in terms of the education that we had for these mortgage brokers? And what we found was people don't want wholesale massive change. That's a funny thing, isn't it? But what they tolerate
it scares them.
It does. But what they do tolerate is incremental change, little bite-sized pieces. What we found out from all these people is, whilst it was good to have an actual learned facilitator or educator within the room, from an overall industry policy process perspective, what they really wanted to do was talk to other mortgage brokers. And so what we fundamentally did was turn our facilitation model on its head, took our facilitators out of the room and made them more what we were actually called analysts for us in terms of actually looking at the program of work that we were doing. It was a certificate 4 and a diploma program. But what we tried to do was then say to a lot of other brokers, how would you actually like to supplement your income, successful mortgage brokers, and come along and tell the stories of how you've put success into practice and what you did and how you went about it and what did you learn along the way and how did you... And we codified that knowledge as we went along. And that was a really, really important aspect for us, because as we codified that knowledge and as we put that knowledge into place, we built up a huge information and knowledge repository for new brokers to actually come in, and it started to actually get their time to their first sale down to 6 weeks worth of learning, and then first sale within a month, which used to be sometimes first sale within 6 months. So there were real aspects about being able to say this peer education model, for want of a better term, produced results in a way that we wouldn't have thought was something that we should be doing. And the other thing that we found is having an average age above the age of 40 said that most people still wanted that face-to-face education. They weren't interested in learning online at that point in time. We had to actually sort of take them along those lines for efficiencies and other things that you actually did. So, you know, those things, I think that they're the typical challenges that we face nowadays, where we can make those small incremental changes and still be taking people down the path of actually understanding that the more analysis you do and the more analytics you have to inform the landscape, the more you can toss around some of the innovation ideas that you want to apply.
And two things I heard in what you said there, Rob, is first of all, you actually treated your learners as a market and did market research on them up front, right?
It's a good summary.
And you also, like the thing you said at the end, so like they're small business people, they care about making their first sale and making that, so that's a critical business metric for them.
Absolutely.
That you are touching on and helping them with.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got those, like the graphs that Marie showed at the end, where you can actually plot that and actually show that incremental difference. And it's not huge. Wasn't a massive change by any stretch of the imagination. But instead of 6 months, you brought it down to the second month, and that meant that people could actually see, yeah, I could actually make a go of this if I keep going with what I'm going with. And, that it was something that I think that sparked within me this whole need to look at the way that I build knowledge repositories for sustainable learning.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that I think learning and development does poorly, and that's why learning and development and the knowledge/information management area of the organisation need to be partners in crime.
Especially if you attend a learning event, once you've left the event, you don't have access to the knowledge anymore. It's gone because you've left that 24, 48-hour, 5-day event or whatever. There has to be a way that knowledge is available all the time, and that you're actually helping people learn where to get it, when they need it, how they need it, and making that available, no matter what it is. Yeah.
So the second question I've got is around, and you've both touched on this, is around the skills that practitioners need to make this happen. Right. So what are the and there's a long list of them, but where do people start? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, look, and it's very, for me, I think if you have not, and I'm going to be very, very honest here in front of my old lecturer, and say my worst subject at university was data analysis. It was a really, really bad subject for me. I struggled. We had full text databases and we had relational databases. And no matter how much Maureen and the team tried to get it through my thick skull, it was a slog on a daily basis to think about sort of relational hierarchies and everything. But interestingly, a year after graduating, I had the opportunity to really deep dive into that and start to actually understand that. And all of a sudden, click, it made sense. And I think data analysis skills, data science, it's such a huge growing area, and more people will say, can we get these skills in to actually do a particular piece of work or what we're doing? Has everybody seen the Amazon video of their storage warehouse facilities and the robots in terms of being able to do that? What I find is the most interesting data point coming out of that whole story is that they eradicated around about 950 jobs to begin with by actually putting those robots in. They've now doubled the workforce inside there in terms of that, because as inventory picked up and sales picked up, they need people who could actually validate, pick, do all the other things that they do in terms of the integration points with the robots. And all of a sudden, artificial intelligence had actually doubled the workforce within those things. So those for me, data analysis and information analysis and sense making, for me, are the top three skills that I work with anybody. And when people say to me, what does sense making mean? I always say, I don't know, what makes sense to you and what makes sense to me can be two very, very different things. But in terms of the context of the organisation and what you're trying to do, you can usually get enough data there to actually start to guide people in terms of what makes sense and what makes a tangible difference.
Thank you, Rob. And is data science scary? Because I know for some people you say the words data science and that the red mist comes down.
No, not at all. In fact, with all due respect, with Maureen being in the room, it's easier now than it was back then. And it's purely because I think what technology has enabled within that now is visibility. So there's a lot of visualization of data now, and there's a lot more visibility in terms of the cross-correlative values and how data matches to each other and doing that. And these data packages now show you everything. So a picture tells 1,000 stories as far as I'm concerned. And there's some of the things. But when you start to deep dive into that and you start to look for the linkages, I think one of the skills that I've developed the most over the last 2 years since joining government is a sense of curiosity. And that is not to accept what is actually in front of me, but to ask questions of what is in front of me. And if I develop that skill of curiosity, what it's done is it's taken me ahead leaps and bounds in terms of that. And I think in the learning and development world, it's even more important to have that sense of curiosity and ask why, what, who, how come. Those things for me are important. Yeah.
Thank you, Rolf.
That's right.
Marie.
Probably the way I would describe it in my terms, from what Rob said, is I look for the commercially savvy piece, which is not just knowing, how to read a P&L, but actually understand how a business works, how a business makes money, and how business gets done in the organisation. The other part was I was actually going to talk about the curiosity to take in ideas outside of your functional area. Relationship builder, be able to build relationships with the stakeholders, new other stakeholders. Now, none of these I'm talking about, like I said, are the old traditional design delivery type skills. And the other thing for me is being having a natural bent towards problem solving, and it's that problem solving using many data points. So, like I said, it's not like a leader saying, I want the time management course and your skill is in going and rolling that out. It is in asking why, what's the problem
Absolutely.
we're trying to solve, how do we do that, how do we know that, what leads you to believe that that's an issue, what are you seeing happening, what would be happening if this didn't occur. And like I was going to the examples before, understanding your workforce, breaking down that data to really understand the best way to solve that issue or whatever it is that's there. Organisations aren't, especially in this space, like endless fonts of cash. So they're always after you to solve their problem in a really kind of unique but time critical way for them. So,
Thanks, Marie. Okay, the audience have been very patient so far, so I think it's only fair to open it up for questions.
Be kind.
Yes, sir.
Application or examples in that sense, I'm pretty curious to find out some examples to apply data analytics like this on the 70-20 part of the model in that sense.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
A lot of formal training solutions in that sense, but I'm pretty curious on your vision and maybe even examples to apply this within the
it's a great question. I might tackle that in two parts. The first one is to actually say the traditional learning and development field, and I'm just about to bag us out very, very badly, but there's not a hell of a lot of empirical, scientific, good, foundational evidence for a lot of adult learning. We've got great adult learning theorists, the David Merrills, Robert Gagne's, and andragogy is not a problem. It's not a problem whatsoever. But when you get to something like the 70-20-10 model, it's championed by Charles Jennings, and I know Charles reasonably well. But it's interesting to... You've ever heard that old thing about people remember 10% of what they see, 20% of what they hear, and then 70% of what they do? And Will Thalmere, Professor Will Thalmere, has anybody ever heard of Will? So please Google him. Two things about Will. He's had a $10,000 reward on offer to anybody who can scientifically prove there is such a thing as a learning style. And he's never paid out his $10,000 yet. And many people have actually tried to actually do that. So that's a really, really interesting piece for me, because he has just as much evidence that can actually debunk that there's no such thing. Now I've neither here nor there on that, but the one thing that he actually did was he said, where did that remember 10%, see and remember and hear, and where did that come from? And he spent 2 years researching the origins of the model that learning and development practitioners had used for 20 years. And it came from a 1968 presentation by the head of learning and development for Mobile Exxon. So it's interesting how that sort of folkloric thing that learning and development practitioners almost feel within their gut becomes empirical evidence in terms of being able to actually do that. So from a 70-20-10, that leads me to the 70-20-10 to be able to say one of the criticisms of 70-20-10 is that, again, that lack of empirical evidence. But I will say that there's more research done on that model now than any of the other models that people have actually used. And I think if you ask learning and development practitioners, does it make sense? Everybody feels within their gut, yes, 70% of what people learn is on the job with a coach, doing something along those lines. 20% of it is usually sitting down with a cup of coffee, having a conversation with a coach or a mentor or something, and 10% of it's in the classroom or online doing what I'm actually doing. So for me, the sense of being able to actually use analytics to prove up what we almost intrinsically and instinctively know to be true is about, we need more practitioners in that space. We need to do more analysis within organisations. A lot of organisations latch on to the latest thing in learning and development without a hell of a lot of research in terms of the analysis behind
the
that.
bright, shiny thing syndrome.
Yeah.
Bright, shiny things that are actually sitting on there. Now, that's not to actually say there's no validity in it. I'm not suggesting that for any stretch of the imagination, but that's how I feel about it, is that people like Will and Stephen Downes and another number of people in this field who sort of are focused on these adult learning and university learning and a whole range of other things. You know, the website No Significant Difference Phenomena. Has anybody actually been there? I got that from UTS. It's a fantastic website. It's got a lot of academic practitioners who have actually submitted research into there, and it's about basically saying whether it's in the classroom, whether it's a blended environment, whether it's video or anything. All of these studies have been submitted to actually say there is probably no significant difference in terms of the mode of delivery. So it comes back to Clark's ice cream truck theory and a few other bits and pieces. So I would just say that's one of the things you've got to sort of do research on rather than saying look for research on it, because I don't think we'll find too much.
From a practical perspective, if I can just interject, the model itself is probably quite useful in that when you have staff who want to sit in a classroom because they think they've got a gap, you sometimes need to demonstrate back to them that you are learning while you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, that's what I said. Intrinsically, gut feel, and instinctively, you know that the model is quite a solid model to use.
As you said about 50 minutes ago, Rob, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
More useful than others.
That's more, yeah. Well, one of the things I was going to say is, even in the team I work in now, I'm so over freaking events. I'm so over the 10, right? And so I have to talk to organisations about learning campaigns, capability campaigns. They run over a longer period of time because you never hit people once. You didn't learn to drive by getting into a car once, right? You had to, keep on doing. You had to read your book. You had to do, all those sorts of things there. So I think I keep talking about a campaign. And the organisation I'm in, it's actually a campaign that's woven in, making sure all the organisation systems reinforce that capability or piece you're trying to build. So it's your comms campaign. It's making sure that your KPIs are consistent. It's making sure your development messages are consistent, even though they can be delivered differently. Make sure your reward programs reinforce whatever it is you're trying to build. Make sure your recruitment, your promotion, realigns to all of that. Now, the reason organisations, kind of get stuck with doing that, how do I, as an L&D person, count that I've done that when rewards doing that, whatever. But you're there to build the capability for the organisation. It's a smarter way of thinking of it. So. Yeah,
I was just going to say, and on the top of that, complexity and systems always count towards that. So I said before, one of the examples we used is, I want to talk to a mortgage broker who's done this. And I want to say, what does that actually look like? Then when you say to yourself, well, that model actually exists for taking the top salesperson so that they can train other salespeople and talk about that, and they're not interested. Why? Because they're remunerated on their wallet share of their sales. And they get their bonuses on that. I'm not going to share my secrets with anybody. So you automatically have a remuneration system that works against that. Sharing of knowledge, sharing of information in terms of doing that. So never discount the scale and complexity of the systems that are in organisations and what they can actually do. So,
and I've just got a quick answer for that as well. And so this just comes from back when I was a sales operations manager, right? And so with the 70 part, right, there are already systems inside organisations that manage performance for better or worse. Like a CRM system, right, which actually, which if you use properly, can track things like how long does it take you to close a deal, how big is the deal, what's your win rate, right? And you can actually hang coaching and learning off that system, right? Because that's what a sales manager should be doing, right? So, in a sense, that's not something the L&D person owns, but it's something they facilitate and support.
Yes, they create the environment.
They
line up the things.
Sorry, there was a question there.
My question is just, what I see increasingly in organisations, people can get very good, even master particular skills, but on the job, and I think that's a great place for people to do that. But I'm amazed at how often I'll go into organisations and see that people have no understanding of why they're doing things, or the upstream one or two steps of where their inputs are coming from, or the downstream of what their steps are being led into, which means they're incredibly vulnerable whenever there's a change. What techniques or tools have you seen that actually help not only people master skills, but actually develop the understanding of the contextual understanding of why they're doing things, what's the impact of what they're doing? Because I think that drives both long-term efficiency, long-term agility, and ultimately satisfaction in what they're doing.
I don't disagree. Why don't you go?
I was going to say, a lot of engagement theory will say, I don't trust those buggers up there, but I trust what my immediate manager tells me. So that concept of leader as coach plays into that for me, but that has to be a framework that exists within an organisation to build that, because I think it's only the most immediate leader that can create the link between what I'm doing, where it goes, and the impact to the bigger organisation or potential for me personally in there. Those guys up there can't do that. So it's a similar thing, actually, saying it's got a number of pieces that hang off it. The organisation can do comms, but I think it's the immediate leader. But that immediate leader needs to know that that's important and that's what's expected of them to do it. So
it's training, coaching skills.
Yeah.
They
and having
definitely.
that role of leaders as a coach, rather than the role of the leader is to tick that the work's done kind of thing. But that's setting expectations in your organisation. Easier said than done.
Yeah, very, very much so. Dan Pink, great author, and he wrote a book called Drive.
Yep.
He talked about autonomy and mastery, and the two can't be excluded if you're truly actually going to understand your position within the organisation. So to give somebody autonomy where they've got to actually go out and actually find out for themselves why they exist, how they link to the mission, the vision, the statement and everything else, is a hard ask of a leader. And it comes back to what Maria's been talking about tonight with leadership frameworks and leadership skills. Is the point of a leader is to actually try and get the best that they can out of the people that they have under their leadership. And for me, that's one of the things that comes back to is actually understanding how much autonomy a person has to become a master of their own domain, as opposed to I've mastered the skill set, but am I necessarily the master of my domain, particularly if I'm told to do it in a certain way and get it done by this time. So there are those core concepts of leadership within organisations. It comes back to challenging this almost feudal system of hierarchy that we actually have in organisations across Australia. I have plenty of people from Europe, particularly the UK, which still accounts for our largest intake of migrants every year, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But the most interesting thing about that is that they're quite shocked at just how much hierarchy we still have in place in Australia. So it's an observation from a lot of people that sort of challenges some of the conceptions that I've always had about an effective management structure. And I've started to learn a lot about that in terms of challenging some of that. But it is all about, it's these sets of skills and these things that we do on a daily basis that actually deliver value. How many times do teams redefine value on a year-by-year basis? How many times do they have an actual new strategy every year? How many times do they actually have a new mode of operating or a modus operandi or anything like that? Sometimes rarely, unless the organisation is driving it from the top. So, you can pick 1,000 reasons as to why that might be complex. Yeah, unfortunately. Down the back, I think.
Rob, you mentioned about the survey that you ran and found that 40 people over 40 prefers online,
face-to-face. Yeah.
I'm just thinking of Marie's situation where she probably has globally a lot of people over 40s. How do you then organize or design your learning so that you reach out to them?
Yeah, so, well, there you go.
It's a great question.
Come and solve my problem for me. It's actually interesting when the history, as I understand, of learning and development at Lend-Lease was it actually used to leave each region to itself, so each global area could go and do what it liked. So I think you probably got, 4 different capability frameworks, leadership frameworks, approaches, etc. there. Then it realised, it wasn't leveraging the synergy that it could of the organisation. So it centralised and head office decided what and how everybody should learn and how they should do things, which was great for head office, but actually found that the regions were building and designing and doing their own thing anyway. What we're now actually saying is how do we set the direction and agree the objectives of what we're trying to achieve through learning and the prioritisation of capabilities that need to be built, and then provide tools to each of our regions so they can then kind of, execute it in the way that means the right thing for their business. Because each of our businesses is structured quite differently, like I said. Some have a lot of people on site. In Australia, they're quite remote. Some have people who are, like in the UK, they're all quite close to the London office. Some, like I said, in Asia are actually in all quite different countries with different languages. In the US, very large geography and quite disparate in terms of how that's there. I can't sit in head office and say how that should happen. And that's where you need to kind of once again put the user-centered design piece onto it and go, who are those people? Where are those people? How do we do that? Now the challenge is to reach all learners in Lend-Lease would actually be very expensive if we wanted to go face-to-face. The senior gentlemen, probably over 40 and 50 in the organisation, they love face-to-face because they've really enjoyed it. So our challenge is really quite difficult in saying, if you want to get out to all of those people all over, you know, where we operate, we don't have the money to do that. We need to find alternate ways. And our goal is to provide development to everyone there. So, so it's a commercial issue. Yeah, we do use, now here's the thing you'd know as well. So we do online learning for compliance training. How exciting is that as a piece of learning? It's like doing your taxes, right? Got to do it. No offence to anyone from the tax office, I shouldn't say that. It's like registering your car, you know, you've got to do it, but you don't find it exciting. Unfortunately, that's people's experience with online learning, first of all, in Lend-Lease. So and this actually happened in Woolworths even more so, because it actually has a challenge getting to the stores and lots of casuals, and in Optus, which was quite remote. It actually is, how do you provide the learning, the online learning, when people aren't sitting at a desk all day? So we all talk about that access to learning, when, where and how you want it and when you need it. Organisations will start to challenge with, well, not everybody has a smartphone. Well, come on, you know, that's kind of not really true. And then there's people don't want to use their own data to access online learning. Do they? Have we asked them? Maybe they would. I know Qantas did a survey and found out 70% of their employees would be happy to use their own data to be able to access learning when they needed it. We still need more of that kind of data, though, I think, to play to the organisation. What I'm trying to say to Lend-Lease is, let's get greater reach at a reduced cost, and that this is the way to do that. And leaders, it's hard for leaders to argue away from that and go, yeah, that's right. Yep. The other thing is, those senior guys in the over 40s and 50s, you're not going to shift them, but you know, the millennials, etc., coming through, build a new world. Those guys are hard to change. And
I was just going to say, in summary, it's a choice. So we had both. We had an online offering that we had a provider for, and if you wanted to do it solely online in the comfort of your own home, pay for that, much reduced cost. Go for it, and we're happy for you to actually do it. And that was augmented with video-based learning, practical examples and conversations that were had with practicing brokers and other people along those lines. We built choice into it so that we actually knew that, but by and large, you know, the analytics that we had told us that people really preferred to come and sit in a room and actually listen with people and converse and engage, sort of thing. So
it'll change over time.
It will. It will inevitably change.
Okay, so Samantha, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I do. I'm wondering what role an individual has to be an independent learner and be responsible for their own learning in their own time and developing their own skills beyond a generic skill set. Yeah. And also, is this ability to be an independent learner a desirable skill in the workplace?
Yes. I've actually put a role in place, but I didn't have this role at Optus and really wanted it, so I've put it in place in Lend-Lease, which is actually about marketing learning in the organisation. Not learning as a function, but actually what's available, how to do it, and that the organisation does actually value self-learning. In fact, we want it. The other message we're really trying to send is, we want you to keep your skills contemporary. Now, if that means we'll show you how to write a good resume to apply for a job internally or externally, let's do that. If that means you're 45 and you think you're about to be made redundant because your project's ending and you want some new skills, let's do that. So that's about what I'm focusing on, is create that learning environment to enable people to do that. But you have to send the message that it's important and it's valued. We've had great response to that as well. Yeah. Similar
within the Department of Education. We've basically said to teachers, it's a self-directed environment. We've got to have what we call a distributed authorship model, and that is the way that we've constructed the learning management system within the department is we have 10,000 learning authors out there. So these are teachers, head teachers and other people who can actually create courses from scratch, both online, Adobe Connect sessions, virtual classrooms, or face-to-face programs, and they will actually put those programs up there. They'll either go for a registered hours so that they can map it back to the teaching standards, or go for non-registered hours so that they can actually just provide a different thought-provoking way of doing it. We get the peer education model happening, and that allows learners to self-identify, Eddie Wu who's in the
Yep.
news, is
Yeah.
running a mathematics symposium for, yes please, I'd like to pay $200 and all of a sudden that's self-directed. We don't have to actually do anything like that. So we look for the potential people that we think can actually really construct that and do that. I think it's more about people being able to actually self-identify those learning paths. Where you have anything that is learner-centred and self-identified, you will always have more success.
Okay. So, hands up for questions. How many more questions do we have? Okay, we've got 3. We are going to do these super quick.
Yes.
Okay, so sir, you.
Okay, this is a quick one. Sorry. So it seems like a major limiting factor in all of this is what you can measure and model, because you can't improve something that you can't measure. There are large companies like Coursera and Udemy, which are actually founded by Ning and Throm, who are 2 of the sort of deep neural network experts and experts in machine learning in general. Obviously, there are a lot of methods there that can be brought to bear on this kind of thing, and I suspect that universities would similarly have very large data sets.
That's a good point.
And a huge amount of control over every point in that process. So they could deploy incredibly sophisticated models. Do we know what the sort of cutting edge models are, or these sort of commercial secrets and so on? Do we sort of know what the what the best way of approaching those sorts of things is, and can they be deployed in the sorts of contexts that you're describing, or is it just the data sets too small?
It's a really, really good point. I would suggest to you that we have a school, I'll leave them nameless because I think they're currently writing a paper of success around this, but they're actually using Canvas, and our Canvas is something that's really challenged the Blackboard market and a lot of the traditional university learning management system markets. But what's incredibly wonderful about Canvas is this learning tools interoperability that they've actually championed, and the data points that come along that line. So for instance, just integration of Google Education Suite with something like Canvas, and being able to measure those points in terms of the interaction space that actually happens with that, and the e-portfolio regime within that. It's a no-brainer. That really, really does work. So I think that's got a lot of opportunity to be able to do that. Funnily enough, corporate learning management systems could probably do that, but they're used woefully badly by corporate organisations. Pretty much they're part of the risk management framework to track compliance education. That's it.
That's how you get funding for them.
Yeah, exactly right. So to your point, there is. One of the interesting things about Coursera, Udemy, and a lot of the others, I'm really interested in the data points of how many people get to a point within a MOOC or anything else and then drop out. Yeah. Because it's the dropout rates for me that don't necessarily suggest that that's a bad thing. It's more that I've learnt what I need to learn, now I'm getting out. And that's the really, really rich sources of data that I think really play a part in terms of being able to do that,
Okay. This lady here.
Thank you, first of all. I actually have 2 questions, but one is really quick. I will start with the longer one. In the lack of relationship with learning and management department, what can a leader do to capture data on their coaching, mentoring, or internal trainings that they do? What sort of data should they capture?
Do you want me to go, or do you want to go?
First.
Yeah, for me, it's all around, start with the business data first. So, and it's a really, really quick one. If you start with the business data and you can get a full, and let me choose something very easy, sales. And you can actually pull the sales data for your organisation very, very quickly to tell you who's good, who's bad, who's not, everything else within that. You then have an indication across that data set, those data points themselves, of different levels of performance. Then you can actually conduct deep further analysis to say, so what makes you successful? What are the types of things that you do, and why do you actually do that? We don't have that qualitative data. We don't know the conversations that happen between individuals or people or other points. Or alternatively, what systems do you use, or online pieces of things to actually inform your choice, and where did you get the innate nature to be successful at what you do, or how come you're struggling? Those types of things.
Just kind of interviews with those.
Absolutely, but everything that I've said about analytics, one of the things I will always say is, I'm not going to dissuade the qualitative from the quantitative. They're both incredibly important. So if I haven't made that clear, please, the quantitative informs your landscape in terms of where you might want to spend time. The qualitative tells you the story as to what might be happening. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, so I was thinking of the outputs, is actually if you look at your engagement survey data, the same thing about qualitative, quantitative in there.
Absolutely.
Depending upon how granular you can get within those results, you'll be able to see what's actually happening and what the impact is there. So what's the impact of leaders who potentially are having those conversations, etc. Also, by doing some analysis on the commentary that comes with your engagement survey that people say, there's usually something fairly rich in there that you can quite often cut down.
Is working or not?
Yeah, that's right. And you can apply analytics over both of those.
I have a little,
especially if you've got a lot of data.
Yeah, I have a little saying.
Time.
I was just going to say I have a little saying that says the quantitative data gets your toe in the door. The qualitative data gets the decision from the leader. Yeah.
I have a tiny question. Just as an additional one. You kind of showed initial diagram of lots of data capturing devices, but you had agile working space there as well. Why? How come it's a data carrier?
Because, depending on whether you're actually collecting the data points themselves. So it just, but you have to go into the model and actually do a little bit more around it in terms of doing it. And I think I put the reference source on the base of the model itself. But you're talking about agile within itself, yeah.
What I'm curious about is how come that's a data carrier?
Because your agile working environments, when you book a meeting room, and what you book the meeting room for and your meeting room booking systems carry a hell of a lot of data as to why you're actually spending time in the meeting room. If you're making decisions within those meeting rooms and you're successful, it's actually a real indicator as to that environment, the people you're meeting with, you get decisions made, you get decisions done.
Okay, thank you. Last question over here.
Okay, I had a quick question about flattening of organisations, but sort of coming from the opposite direction. So a lot of organisations, as they grow, find themselves, even if they're a flat organisation to start with, implementing hierarchies often because employees want that sense of achievement or sense of growth, but also so organisation becomes easier from the management point of view. Do you find this counterproductive, considering that you're talking about other organisations flattening or...
There's the one thing I would actually point you towards, I don't know whether he's still got it on Vimeo, but the CEO of Atlassian and some of the creators of Atlassian, great success story in terms of building an organisation and actually growing an organisation. He laments having to put in a hierarchy and is actually talking about how much damage it's actually done to the organisation. What we don't have, and I will actually say this, is the reason why hierarchies persist is because we don't have alternatives. Because when you do, and I recognise the point, and I think it's a very, very valid point, is as organisations actually grow, to have lots and lots and lots of flat teams also may be very, very complex in terms of being able to actually do that. But I still think that there's a thing that says there's a CEO level, and then there's a CFO and a Chief Operating Officer, and then there's one layer of multiple pods of people, and how do you actually handle that? Do you take multiple sets of skills and actually put them all in? Do you put them against each other in terms of achievement? What do you actually... We just, from an OD perspective, I think Marie would agree with me, we've never explored alternative models. And it's a real lack within Australia to actually look at that, because we wouldn't know what an alternative is besides startup and large hierarchical organisations. It's about doing something.
The other thing I was just going to really quickly say, because I know you're going to wrap up, horses for courses, and I think people think there is an org model that resides over time. Depends on what your strategy is, depends on what the purpose is, whether it's short term, long term, etc., and how you organise yourself to get things done. But I think there's lessons that have been learned around the speed of communication and decision making that play into that. That's got to be around what you're trying to achieve. And
Miss Hopeful, Mr. Cynical.
Okay, and on that note, so thank you.